Hey guys, I acknowledge that Horror Month this year is starting a little late. Sorry about that, I just wanted to get some other videos out of the way beforehand, but I'm kicking off 2022's Horror Month with a review of the silent horror classic Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror, or simply Nosferatu. Now, Nosferatu is a German horror film released in 1922, and in March of this year, the film saw its 100th anniversary. Now, the film was directed by F.W. Murnau, who also directed films like The Haunted Castle, The Last Laugh, and Faust. Now, Murnau was also a gay man in a time when homosexuality really wasn't accepted, so I'm sure he probably kept that hidden at the time. We also have to keep in mind that this was Germany, and granted, this was still several years before Hitler would come to power, but still, I believe there were some laws against homosexuality at the time in Germany, as there were in probably a lot of places in the world at the time. The movie was also produced by Albin Grau, whose name I'm no doubt butchering. Now, he was actually a pretty interesting figure in his own right. He was heavily involved in the occult, and I don't know if he was outright friends with him, but I know he was associated and personally knew Aleister Crowley. And there's a scene in the movie where the vampire is reading this document with all these cryptic symbols on it, and apparently those were real symbols used in magic and alchemy. The screenplay for the film was written by Henrik Galeen, whose name I'm also probably butchering. Now, he also wrote the silent film Waxworks and the 1926 remake of The Student of Prague. And the movie is loosely based on the 1897 novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, of course, Dracula was not the first vampire novel, and legends of vampires have existed throughout human history. Nevertheless, Dracula has sort of become the definitive vampire story of the 20th century, and even now into the 21st century. Like, I can hardly think of a piece of vampire fiction that has come after Dracula that doesn't owe something to that novel in some way, shape, or form. Now, I already reviewed this movie, Nosferatu, 10 years ago, back in 2012 when I did a special called Dracula Week, where I reviewed different Dracula movies. That review is still up, however it's no longer public, it's now marked as unlisted, but you can still see it on the Dracula Week playlist, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Now, Nosferatu is the oldest surviving adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but believe it or not, this actually wasn't the first Dracula movie. Prior to this, in 1921, there was a Hungarian film called Dracula's Death. Dracula's Death is now considered to be a lost film. There are no known copies of the movie in existence, because we have to keep in mind, this was before digital, this was back when films were literally on film reels, and I think because film was in its relative infancy at the time, it wasn't really taken that seriously as an art form, so I think because of that, they wouldn't make that many copies of a film, and sometimes I think they would just show a film and then discard it, or sometimes what little copies there are of a film would have just gotten lost, stolen, or destroyed in warehouse fires. So unless somebody miraculously finds the film reels, we are never going to see Dracula's Death. But from what little is known about the film, apparently it owes very little to Bram Stoker's novel other than the name. Apparently Dracula isn't really a vampire in the movie at all. I think he's supposed to be like a mental patient who thinks he's Dracula. So, for all intents and purposes, Nosferatu is the oldest surviving Dracula movie, but at the time it was actually considered to be an unofficial and unauthorized adaptation. Now, Bram Stoker died 10 years earlier, and F.W. Murnau could not secure the rights to the book from Bram Stoker's widow. The book wasn't public domain at that point. But F.W. Murnau basically said fuck it and decided to make the movie anyway, but he changed the names of the characters. Most notably, the main villain went from Count Dracula to Count Orlok. Now keep in mind, because this is a silent film, there's no actual dialogue, so whenever a character speaks or whenever there's narration, it comes up as title cards. And for the title cards of the original German version of the film, they referred to the vampire as Count Orlok. However, there were later versions of the film that would change the title cards and basically change the vampire's name back to Dracula, as well as changing the names of several of the other characters back to what their names were in the book. For example, I have the movie on this box set here called Horror Classics, and the version that's on this box set calls him Dracula. I also have the movie on this box set, also called Horror Classics, and I have it on this box set as well. Because the film is public domain, you could find it on almost any of these public domain box sets. Now, even though in the original version of the film the characters' names were changed, this was not fooling Bram Stoker's widow, and she convinced the German courts that the film was copyright infringement on her late husband's novel, so Germany ordered all copies of the movie destroyed, but luckily the producers had extra prints stashed away somewhere, and the film survived. And thank God it did, because imagine if Nosferatu became a lost film as well. I don't think the horror genre as we know it now would be the same if not for this movie. Like, this movie influenced so much going forward. Even the Bela Lugosi Dracula, which came out 9 years later, yeah, they're both based on the same book, but even that owes a lot to this movie. Now, the plot of Nosferatu is it's set in the 1830s, and it follows a real estate agent named Hutter, or Harker, depending on which version of the film you watch, who learns about a count from Transylvania named Orlok, or Dracula, again, depending on which version of the film you see, who wishes to buy property in Hutter's home city. So Hutter travels to Transylvania, but when he tells the locals that he's going to see Count Orlok, they regard him with fear and suspicion and try to convince him not to go to Orlok's castle, and they basically treat Orlok as if he's the devil himself. So when Hutter gets to Orlok's castle, he discovers that his client is in fact a vampire who starts terrorizing him and essentially holds him captive in his castle. Eventually Orlok travels to Hutter's home city, where he spreads a devastating plague and starts going after Hutter's wife. Now, it's hard to say if Nosferatu is my favorite Dracula movie, but I think this is by far the creepiest adaptation of Dracula. This movie is 100 years old, and it still has some of the creepiest, most nightmarish imagery of any horror film. The way I would describe this is this movie feels like the nightmare that you have after reading the book Dracula. And the whole film has this surreal, dreamlike quality to it. Now, in the film, Count Orlok, or Count Dracula, was played by Max Schreck, who is genuinely chilling in the role. Now, for years there have been rumors that actor Max Schreck really did look like that in real life, like he was known to very little makeup, and even I kind of bought into those rumors a little bit, but that's not completely accurate, because I've seen pictures of what the guy actually looked like, and he looks normal to me. But either way, this is probably the most repulsive incarnation of the Dracula character. Now, yes, I know, the whole idea of Dracula being a suave, seductive, almost sexy character didn't really start until Bela Lugosi started playing the role in plays, and then in Todd Browning's Dracula. But even in the novel, there was sort of a sexuality to this character. Count Orlok is probably the most non-sexy version of this character that I could think of. And even in the scene when Hutter first meets Orlok before he realizes that he's a vampire, there's still something very off about him, and you almost get the sense that this is something that might have never been human to begin with, but it's sort of trying to pretend to be human. And the fact that the vampire is spreading a plague when he comes to the city, which, yes, I know, it's actually just him feeding on people and city officials are mistaking it for being a disease, but you really do get a sense in this movie that Warlock is like a living personification of disease, of plague, that this is the plague personified. Now, being that this movie came out not that long after the Spanish flu pandemic, you could say that the movie is maybe making a commentary on that. In the film, Greta Schroder plays Ellen or Nina, depending on which version of the film you see, who of course is based on the character of Mina from the novel. Gustav von Wangenhein, whose name I'm no doubt butchering, plays Hutter or Jonathan Harker, again depending on which version of the film you see. Alexander Granach plays the character of Knock, who is the Renfield stand-in, and he does a really good job in this movie. John, and I'm definitely gonna butcher this last name, but I think it's Gottowt. He plays the character of Professor Bulwer, who is the stand-in for Abraham Van Helsing. Now, Van Helsing is an extremely integral character for both the novel and many different adaptations of Dracula. Like, he's arguably the most important character in Dracula lore besides Dracula himself. He's essentially Dracula's arch-nemesis. But in this movie, the Van Helsing character is really only a minor character and doesn't appear to have anywhere near the same knowledge of vampires that his counterpart from the book did. But we also have to remember that even though this movie is clearly based on Dracula, it is only a loose adaptation, and in theory, Murnau was trying to hide the fact that this was actually a Dracula movie originally. But yeah, I cannot recommend Nosferatu enough. I think this is an amazing film. Just keep in mind that if you're not used to silent films, they could be kind of an acquired taste, but even if you don't end up liking this movie at all, you gotta at least respect this movie. And even if you're not a big horror fan, if you're somebody who's interested in film history, I think this is an important movie to check out just for the historical significance. Now I want to cut to some friends of mine giving their thoughts on this silent horror classic, and when it cuts back to me, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the film's legacy. Now, the first short review you're going to see is from my friend Jeremy.
F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu is a classic horror film from the silent era. It's an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, as Murnau couldn't get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow. He changed the characters' names and a few story details, but for the most part, it stays pretty faithful to the novel. I really want to mention Max Schreck's performance as Count Orlok. He's perfectly creepy, and I must say, he has some of the craziest eyes I have ever seen. I remember someone, I think it was Robert Englund, said that when he turns around, his eyes turn first, and then his head, which I think adds to his creepiness. Some of the shots in this movie are tinted with various colors, and I must say, they look absolutely gorgeous. When Bram Stoker's widow found out about this movie, she demanded that all copies of it be destroyed, and a lot of them were. But thankfully, some of them survived, and because of that, we still have this amazing movie available to us today.
This next short review is from my friend Christian Feliciano.
Nosferatu. Now, when I was little, and I don't know how this happened, I didn't realize that Nosferatu was supposed to be Dracula. I just saw it as another vampire film. I never realized that it was actually an adaptation of Bram Stoker's book. And it's actually one of the first, if not the first film, based on Dracula. And that just surprised me when I found out, like, later on. I was like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. But then, of course, I had to watch it again, because when I was little, I didn't really remember the film either. I did like it a lot. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really creepy, but at the same time, I was little, so I didn't realize it. But, now that I'm older, I'm more educated, and I've seen it more times, I understand that, yes, that was pretty much one of the first, if not the first, adaptation of Dracula. They just changed the name because they were basically stealing the content, and I know that I believe that the judge had the copies of the film destroyed, but that some of them existed, so that's the reason why we still have it today. That, to me, is awesome, that this film survived, because, first of all, it's a great film, and I'm really glad about it. I really like that we have this piece of art still here, that we can still look back and go, wow, even in the silent film days, they still loved horror the way we love horror today. And to be honest, Nosferatu is like I said before, is a great film. It really is a really enjoyable watch. The acting in it is very silent filmish. You know, it's a lot of over dramatic gestures and stuff, but they really do capture horror. They do make it very, very creepy and very entertaining to watch. And the way that Count Olaf is played is fantastic. I think his name is Max Schreck, plays Count Olaf. I love his performance as the vampire. He is fantastic. He's creepy. I like the way his eyes move first, then his head moves. I love the scenes where you see, you know, his shadow on the wall and the way he walked. He was all creepy with his long fingernails, and oh, it was awesome, awesome, awesome. I love. There's a scene where he rises up out of his grave, not his grave, his casket, and oh man, the way they did that back then, it's just fantastic. I love old black and white films, whether they're silent or they have sound. I just love old horror films. I think that this is definitely one of the best. This is up there with Dracula, with the Wolfman, with Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein, all the best horror films from that era. I just absolutely love it, and I recommend that everybody check it out. If you're not used to silent films, I just got to warn you, it is different. You're just gonna be, if you've never seen a silent film before, it's gonna be a different viewing. But trust me, if you give it a chance and you try to get into it, you're gonna really, really enjoy it. And if you love silent films and you haven't seen this one, I mean, you have to see this one. This one is one of the best. So yeah, thank you so much. Bye bye.
Now I want to cut to a video of my friend John and his father talking about this movie. Now this is actually edited from a video that he did on his own YouTube channel, which I'll leave a link to in the description below.
Dad, do you think Nosferatu is still scary?
I think it's a very scary movie. Part of that added to by the fact that it's a silent movie. And it's just very unique in the appearance and performance of the main character,
right?
And also in its use of natural effects, natural environment, I should say,
Yeah.
as opposed to what we saw with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari,
Yeah.
which was mainly all staged.
Yes, absolutely. Whereas this film is like really, you're on like they were like actually really there on like location, like the. Like when they're on the boat, for instance, it's like in today's like modern day like film world, they would like have like the sets. They really were on like a location out in the sea in the middle of nowhere in that scene.
Right, and the castle, the traveling in the coach, mountains and everything makes everything look more ominous.
Yeah. Once again, another time capsule type of film where you really feel you're watching historical stuff from like 1922. And also, let's talk about Max Schreck. Oh, he really still like is scary and frightening to watch to this day.
Yes, he is. I'm just so impressed by the way he looked and the way he acted also.
Yeah.
And the way Murnau has him popping up, rising from the ground and things makes it even scarier.
I always like love those shots of like where he pops out of his coffin or he rises up from the boat or he looks around. It gives it that very, very creepy, sinister look. And again, it's another like iconic performance for someone who's never seen the film because that character has become iconic in today of pop culture for horror fanatic fans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it has. And I really felt sympathy for the character that went out to sell him the real estate.
Yes.
I mean, he seemed, like such a nice guy.
Yeah.
With a beautiful wife and
right. Actually, fiance. Actually.
Oh, I'm sorry, fiance.
Yeah.
And have him sit there and what's going to happen.
Right. I think what's funny about watching this, I'm thinking about because before I saw this film, I saw Dracula first, and I'm comparing all the similar same format of the Dracula elements, but of course because this was one of the first Dracula adaptations. Again, Murnau just took the same idea but just changed it. Yeah, like you said, no, I agree. His character was very sympathetic, and you really want to blame his real estate boss. His boss is like the real jerk,
Right,
who is
yeah,
why
that's
this happened. Any other thoughts about the movie that come to mind about Nosferatu?
Well, I enjoyed the Blu-ray version because the images are so clear, and also I love the score that was associated with it. It really adds to the drama of the movie.
Right.
So if you really want to get a full picture and be totally immersed in the movie, I would recommend the Blu-ray.
I remember the first time I saw it was on that DVD you had. You said, and where did you get it of all places?
Yeah, I got it at Disney World.
Yeah, in the happiest place on the planet. Because I think that was before. Well, that was before Blu-rays at that time, and that was also. But I think that was the only way I could see the movie was on that DVD we had, because there wasn't a Blu-ray yet before in the late 2000s. I mean,
right.
Blu-rays were around, but not everything was on Blu-ray at that time.
The DVD is nice. It's good, but the Blu-ray's worth the upgrade.
I agree on that one. How would you rank this among other or just vampire films in general?
I think this has to rank at the top of all the vampire films that I've seen.
Right.
And even though it's in old technology and it's silent, I still think that I still rank it high.
Right.
So it's something worth seeing, and see it on Halloween.
Yes.
In the dark.
Yes. Actually, double feature. You can watch Caligari and Nosferatu back to back for a very creepy, atmospheric, horrifying night. Would you? Well, here's a tricky question: Lugosi or this movie?
Lugosi is such an iconic figure as Dracula,
right?
And that's the person that I've always associated with vampires.
Same, especially that was the first Dracula film I ever saw as a kid.
Right.
It was the Universal Monsters Dracula.
Yeah, so I would have to say that that edges out Nosferatu.
Right.
But Nosferatu is just a little bit below that.
Okay, so that was our review of Nosferatu. See you next time.
Now, if I were to sit here and talk about every single thing that Nosferatu has influenced, this would probably be a 5-hour video. Like I said earlier on in this video, I really don't think horror movies as we know them today would be the same if not for this movie. And especially not vampire movies. For example, now the movie ends, spoiler for a film that's 100 years old, the movie ends with Ellen sacrificing herself to keep Warlock with her until daytime, and then we see Warlock killed by the first rays of sunlight. And this is the first time you see a vampire killed by sunlight. Because in the original novel by Bram Stoker, keep in mind it's been several years since I've read it, but in the novel, Dracula was weakened by sunlight, and he did need to sleep during the day in his native soil, but sunlight was never outright lethal to him. He was still able to walk around in the daylight. And again, this was the first time you saw a vampire killed by sunlight, and that's become such a fixture of vampire lore that it's pretty much expected in modern vampire stories. That's why it's kind of funny to me that even though stories and legends of vampires have existed throughout human history, everything we think we know about vampire lore really comes from the movies. And once again, this movie definitely had an influence on later adaptations of Dracula. Like, I believe Todd Browning and Carl Freund really did study this movie when they were making their version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi, which of course is the most famous adaptation of the Dracula story. But I think even the Hammer films with Christopher Lee definitely owe something to Nosferatu, and even Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Dracula owes something to Nosferatu. There's a scene in the original Fright Night where Jerry Dandridge rises out of his coffin in the exact same way that Count Orlok rose out of his coffin in one of the most iconic scenes of Nosferatu. And of course, the look of Count Orlok has been copied so many times in Tobe Hooper's adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. The main villain, Kurt Barlow, who is basically Stephen King's version of Dracula, had the whole Count Orlok look. The villain of the graphic novel 30 Days of Night was definitely drawn to have sort of a Count Orlok look. I believe Guillermo del Toro and David S. Goyer said that the Reapers in Blade 2 were definitely meant to have sort of a Count Orlok look to them. There was a villain on the anime Hellsing who was basically meant to be Count Orlok. I think his name was even an anagram for Count Orlok. Now, while this next example I'm about to bring up is not a vampire movie, the whole German expressionist movement, which Nosferatu is very much a part of, was a huge influence on Tim Burton, and in Tim Burton's Batman Returns, one of the main villains was the character of Max Schreck, played by Christopher Walken, and obviously that character's name was a direct reference to Nosferatu. Count Orlok even showed up in an episode of SpongeBob, and I think it was that episode that is the reason that most people of my generation even know the name Nosferatu. Now, on the surface, Nosferatu might seem like a perplexing movie for me to review for Horror Month, where I usually review all the films of different horror franchises, but there was kind of a franchise that was spawned from this movie. There was a remake of this film in 1979 directed by Werner Herzog called Nosferatu the Vampire, with Klaus Kinski playing the Count Orlok role, only in that movie they actually called him Count Dracula. There was also sort of a spiritual sequel to the 1979 Nosferatu in 1988 called Nosferatu in Venice, also known as Vampire in Venice. And then in 2000, there was a brilliant film called Shadow of the Vampire, which was a fictional story about the making of Nosferatu, but it played on this whole idea that what if actor Max Schreck really was a vampire? And if you wanted to, you could almost count Shadow of the Vampire as sort of like a metafiction sequel to Nosferatu, and I decided to sort of count all four of these films in sort of the, what I would call the loosely connected Nosferatu franchise. So my next movie review is going to be on the 1979 remake, so stay tuned for that, and bye.